I talk about the idea of randomness and regularity. And there's this wonderful picture on page 8 of Harry S. Truman, who was our president from from 1945 through the beginning of 1953. Truman ran for re-election in 1948 against John Dewey, I believe. And Truman was not a very popular president in 1948, and the conventional wisdom was that he was going to lose that election. And he was behind in the polls all summer long. He launched this campaign called Whistle Stop Campaign, where he got on a train and go from city to city across the country and give speeches. And he was a political scrapper. He started making some inroads and building himself back up in the polls. But by the time around election day came, the media really thought that he was done. He was not going to win re-election. And in order to verify their thoughts about the election, the news media of the day, the newspapers, on election day or the day before, they called a lot of people. And so they did some polling through the telephones and called lots of people and said, well, who'd you vote for? Who are you going to vote for? And by looking at those results statistically, it said that John Dewey was going to beat Harry Truman. And, well, it was a very close election. And this big grin on Truman's face, he's holding up the Chicago Daily Tribune newspaper, which says that Dewey defeats Truman. But I bet you've never heard of President Dewey. Of course, Truman beat him. So how did the newspapers get it wrong? They did statistical sampling. They polled people, and they got it wrong. So they made a bet, which is what statistics is. It uses probability, in a sense, to make a bet on a conclusion. And they lost that bet. And there's a very simple reason why they were so misled by the statistics. It's because in 1948, unlike today, everybody has telephones today, but in 1948, telephones were a luxury. And the demographics of the country were such in 1948, the blue-collar, lower-class working man tended to vote for Democrats and tended to not have telephone. The upper-class, middle-class, management, white-collar type jobs tended to be more Republican in those days. And those people made a little more money, and they were more likely to have telephones. So the polls were skewed because the sample which they took was biased toward Republicans in 1948. This has happened in other election cycles, and I'll talk about that as we move along here. And in more recent times, the polls were skewed in favor of the Democrat. And so it really doesn't matter the political party. It's the basis on which they poll people for these polls is very sensitive to things, to biases. And this is a very classic example in 1948. I love that example. And but what's the issue here? Well, statistics is a very well developed science. It's a very big subject. It's based entirely on mathematics. It's based upon mathematical theorems, and mathematical theorems work. However, they only work when the assumptions are correct. And the big assumption, perhaps the largest assumption about statistics, is that when you do statistics, you base it upon samples of data. And are those samples of data obtained at random? Do they truly reflect the bigger pool or the bigger population from which it came? So, for example, in 1948, if you called more Republicans, then the poll would indicate that the country is going to elect a Republican president. In recent years, pollsters have been calling on Friday nights for some reason. And because the timing is perfect, I guess, for the newspaper releases, somehow a lot of the media has picked Friday night as a time to call. Well, the polls kept being skewed toward Democrats in recent years. And well, why is that? Well, someone finally was determined that for whatever reason, Republicans tended to be not at home on Friday night as often as Democrats. I don't know why, but for some reason, if Democrats are more home on Friday nights and you call them Friday nights, then you're going to get more Democrats. And so that'll skew the polls in those directions. So when that data is not truly a random selection from the larger population, when there's a bias built in, then the statistics doesn't work as well. May not work at all. It may backfire on you. So that's a big issue in statistics, is we call it statistical sampling. And we don't get into that in any large way at all in this course. That's a pretty advanced topic for statistics majors to get into statistical sampling theory, and it's a big deal. But here we're to learn about statistics, and we're going to assume that all our samples are randomly chosen. They do reflect the population, the demographics of the population, and so therefore that assumption will be okay. However, it's good to bring this up because among other things in this course, we want you to come out to be a lot more statistically astute about what you see out there. All right, well, we'll see some more examples of this. But in page 9, section 1.3, Central Ideas in Statistics, another one of these little cutesy titles the authors use, Randomness and Regularity, Twins in Tension. Randomness and regularity, what does that mean? Well, I think a simple example is flipping a coin. So suppose I flip a coin and it comes up either heads or tails, and the coin is balanced. So what would you expect the odds are that you flip a coin and get heads? It's going to be 50-50, right? 50% heads, 50% tails. All right, now suppose you flip the coin 10 times. Does that mean you're going to get 5 heads and 5 tails? You'll expect to get 5 heads and 5 tails, but will you always get 5 heads and 5 tails? Of course not, because there is some randomness involved in that selection or in that experiment. And so it would be very common to see 6 heads, 4 tails, maybe 7 tails, 3 heads, some kind of mix there. And now what if you flipped 100 coins? Well, if we flipped 100 coins, you expect 50 heads, 50 tails. And would you expect to see maybe 80 heads and 20 tails? Probably not. And you shouldn't. That's an extremely rare result. I've never seen it, actually. And so the most extreme result I've ever seen is 75 heads, 25 tails in flipping 100 coins. So I'll talk about that later. I've done some computer simulations, and I'll bring out my handouts and show you those.